Dad just wished me good luck. What a bloke. That's right, we don't need him. Well, ladies and gentlemen, whilst this negative team were able to give us some idea of what was happening in Afghanistan before the invasion, at times with absolutely no idea of the understanding of the political circumstances of the country a decade ago, what they weren't able to engage with was just the reality of Afghanistan as it stands. A country that was named the 7th most failed state in the world in 2011. A country in which, cheers guys, the Taliban still has significant levels of power. A country in which the kind of human rights atrocities they were talking about are still occurring. And a country in which we've seen the emboldenment of, the emboldening of terrorist organisations there and throughout the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, in reflecting on today's debate, I'm going to look at the 3 criteria we brought up at first Affirmative to judge whether the war in Afghanistan has done more harm than good. Firstly, what are the effects actually domestically in Afghanistan? Secondly, what's the effect on terror networks in the region? And finally, the effect on our capacity to pursue the global war on terror. So let's get right into Afghanistan. The first thing I want to talk about here is civilian deaths, because what this team has tried to do is create this idea that we have all these human rights atrocities and on our side we just have the casualties of war. We want to make a few points about this. Firstly, it's a false dichotomy. Beck told you at second, and this was ignored by this team, that last year on the front cover of Time magazine we had the woman with her nose chopped off and who had acid thrown in her face, which might have been why the nose was all fucked up. Anyway, which basically does show it shows us that these human rights atrocities are still occurring, so we think that was a false dichotomy to create. But secondly, the casualties of war are far more significant than this team wanted to paint out. It's not just people on the front line; it's these civilians being killed by the tens of thousands by drone attacks over their over their villages and their towns. And so we think that was problematic. But also I want to look at this idea of civilian deaths with respect to what's actually going on with the Taliban. So, first of all, we want to make the point that this team's characterization of the Taliban having complete control over Afghanistan before the invasion is largely mistaken. They had some control within the south of the country, but what we saw was a largely undeveloped country in the sense of tribal societies existing before. And so the problem is then comparing that to now, what we see is a Taliban that still has control of areas like the Kandahar and other regions in the south of Afghanistan. They still have control in these areas, and 12 years of war has been unable to remove that. And we think the important point here as well is that the Taliban have only been empowered by the invasion, because people increasingly have to make a choice between whether they like the West and the United States, who they see bombing their villages every day, or whether they like a force that opposes that. So it drives people towards the Taliban, which only perpetuates those kind of human rights atrocities that this team wanted to talk about. So we think that means it's worse for civilians. And it's also, and crucially, aligned the interests of the Taliban, who isn't necessarily a political organisation to the extent that things like Al-Qaeda are, and it's aligned their interests with these terrorist organisations because they find a common enemy in the West. So it encourages engagement, it encourages aligned interest and cooperation there, where it wouldn't necessarily have occurred if we never intervened. But now let's look at this idea of economic prosperity in terms of its effect in Afghanistan. What we heard was that we now have roads where we didn't before, and Russia built a pipeline. So the problem here, right, is that that's not really that good. If we think about it, it's really not. But the point is, right, is that we need to actually do a comparison with what would have happened if we hadn't invaded, where we wouldn't have the infrastructure that we initially had destroyed by war. We think in that situation we would have had more Russian pipelines and the like. And we also think crucially on the idea of economic prosperity, because if we weren't bombing the country day in, day out and fighting on the ground, we would have allowed for economic development, which would have lowered the infant mortality rate more than from 75% to whatever made up figure they gave. Now, but also looking finally on this issue with Hamid Karzai's government, what we think here is they painted a very, very rosy picture of what's going on with Hamid Karzai's government. The idea it does not have significant significant levels of control throughout the region, as evidenced by like the Taliban's control in the southern areas of the country. Like the fact that they're able to engage in coalitions, and it's given people like an experiment in the project of democracy is great. But if we buy their analysis, this kind of stuff needs to happen organically. What it shows us is that we've like imposed this system on them. Everyone views Hamid Karzai's government as a puppet of the West, which means people lose faith in the democracy they wanted to give. So we think a couple of things are important as well on this, which is that firstly, the kind of services that they wanted to say, which we reject the extent to which they're being provided by this government at the moment, we would say like to an extent, like the Taliban does provide those services to their people in the south, and like while tribal society isn't an ideal way of organising society, like there was that capacity for services to be provided in that way, and like for the economic development to lead to a better provision of services. But secondly, what we told you at second and wasn't responded to, this government still relies on the West to maintain control, and we see like when the West pulling out at the end of 2014 completely, we see the capacity for like that government to fall apart. So that's why we think the most important issue in this debate, the effect in Afghanistan, fell to our side. But secondly, what were the effects on terror networks in the region? Let's look at Al-Qaeda. So firstly, like obviously there was like an early success in that we ostensibly pushed Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. The problem is it's begun to filter back in over time, for a start. And secondly, we've only pushed it to other areas. There are other more dangerous areas like Pakistan and like Yemen, ladies and gentlemen. So it was nice for Tim to bizarrely say that Pakistan is like a great ally and we're happy to have them there, when like his example of Osama bin Laden was a case where we had to intervene. We had to go in without their permission to go and get him because they didn't tell us that they had him, which is like serves only to prove their point. And also, like the fact that there is we've got a nuclear belligerent state is incredibly harmful in that respect too, to have Al-Qaeda infiltrating. What about this issue of anti-Western sentiment? Like the idea that winning hearts and minds doesn't matter is pretty shit, guys, because like that was like one of the major goals of like both Stanley McChrystal's and David Petraeus's like campaigns. And also like Tim totally undermined his point when he was like the terrorist organisations really need to win the hearts and minds of people in their communities, because like you can't have it both ways there. We think that there's a fundamental problem when we have like when what we've seen is like people an increasing anti-Western sentiment, because that means that the kind of terrorist organisations that you wanted to talk about being disempowered by our invasion aren't disempowered at all. They're emboldened because they can use stuff like the torture in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, and they can use the evidence, physically what people see when they're like their families are killed, to radicalise moderates and to embolden more people to come onto their side rather than the side of the West. So for those reasons, we don't think that it improved the cause for like terrorist networks in the region. Quickly onto the global war on terror. We told you a few things at first. We told you like the financial implications of trillions of dollars spent on this war made it like less possible to pursue the war on terror in other more useful ways. We told you that like there's just not a lot of will for war because of things like the longest military campaign in the US's history is still going on. And we told you like crucially that the coalition of the willing that came in quickly became unwilling as the war wasn't going well, and that's why Europe sort of backed out to a significant degree. So Tim was just like, we're happy to defend like fighting the global war on terror when we're doing a good cause, which only presumed a lot of his material that we refuted later. And then Gabby said like, well, at least we're not having state-sponsored terrorism, and that's good. Well, we think that's like simplistic because we've just imposed the state there and said, well, now it's not state-sponsored terrorism because this is the definition of a state. But also like it's simplistic because like the infiltration of Afghanistan, like in Pakistan, of Al-Qaeda at every level of society is like basically tantamount to state-sponsored terrorism in that respect. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll conclude now. Because the war in Afghanistan has done more harm than good in terms of the domestic effects in Afghanistan, in terms of like terrorist networks in the region, and in terms of our ability and willingness to prosecute the global war on terror, we're very proud to propose this motion. Are we waiting? Am I allowed to go to the bathroom?